Hello, everyone. We're looking at the New Answers book, lesson number 17, and it talks about, are there really differences in races? Are there really different races? Okay, and you know, currently, especially right now in America, you turn on any news story, you look at anything, and race is highlighted often in almost every thing you look at. There's lots of issues that are quote race related, and it's something that you kind of can't get away from right now in America, especially. But it's been going on for a very long time. This debate about race, even in Christian circles, where we'd like to think that we are more accurate, more true. There's been a lot of confusion. There was people back in the 1800s that used the Bible as an excuse for slavery. They justified slavery through verses in the Bible. And in more modern times, there was kind of this push about not marrying in between races and saying that was biblical. And the verse they used for that was primarily 2 Corinthians 6:14, that says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness?" And as I said, that verse was used to kind of show and claim that there were separate races and that Christians shouldn't intermarry among those races. And so this chapter, this book, wants to talk about the very real issue of race and what marriage God actually frowns upon. Okay? And so briefly, this gets into a very quick history of what constitutes a race. In early history, before Darwin and Darwinism, excuse me, there was, people would say races, and they truly meant things like the English race, the Irish race, the Spanish race, and they're more defining nation groups and tribal groups than they were actual races. Okay, it referred to people groups. Then we had Darwin explode on the scene and Darwinian evolution explode on the scene, and that kind of pushed this separation of races. And Darwinian evolution is inherently a racist philosophy. It taught different races showed up at different times in the world, and it also taught that some groups are closer or more ape-like than others. The book says that leading evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould claimed biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. It just goes to show and saying that, yes, it's not like Darwin created, this racism, but it encouraged it, it highlighted it, and he kind of forced it with his theory. So as a result of Darwinian evolution, many people started thinking in terms of the different people groups around the world representing different, quote, races. And this has resulted in many people, even all the way up to today, even if you're not an evolutionist, even if you don't believe in Darwinian evolution, it's resulted in people today consciously or unconsciously having ingrained prejudices against certain other groups of people. And sadly, that's the truth. And we need to unlearn that behavior, okay? And so one of the things most people can agree on is science, right? And so if we look at science and what science says about races, it says scientists today admit that biologically, there really is only one race of humans, just one. Okay, there's not three, there's not five, there's really one, just one race of humans, okay? People have said we all bleed red, which is true. But it's about one race. Scientists today, the book says, admit that biologically there is only one race of humans. For instance, a scientist at the Advancement of Science Convention in Atlanta stated, quote, "Race is a social construct derived mainly from perceptions conditioned by events of recorded history, and it has no basis biological reality." Okay, there's no biological reality in race. Another study by ABC News, an article put out by ABC News says, more and more scientists find that the differences that set us apart are cultural and not racial. It goes on to say that we accept the idea of race because it's a convenient way of putting people into broad categories, frequently to suppress them. The most hideous example was provided by Hitler's Germany, and racial prejudice remains common throughout the world, unfortunately. Okay, and I like the fact how it said it's a way to put people into broad categories, frequently to suppress them. Right? We don't need to put them in a broad category unless we're trying to claim there's a problem with them or to make ourselves feel better about it. In an article in the Journal of Counseling and Development, researchers agreed that the term race is basically so meaningless that it should be discarded. That's what science says. Scientists say, it's useless. It's a terminology used to prejudice people, to bias people, to place them into groups, to suppress them, and there's no use for it. We should get rid of it. That's what the scientists are saying. Well, what about the Bible? What does the Bible say about race? Well, the Bible does not even use the word race in reference to people. Not at all. But it does describe all human beings as being of, quote, one blood in Acts 17. Okay? What about racial differences? Okay, some people claim, oh, there's racial differences. Well, not everybody is alike, and that's true. But some people think there must be different races of people because there appear to be major differences between various groups, such as skin color and eye shape, etc. However, the truth, though, is that these so-called racial characteristics are only minor variations among people groups. If one were to take any two people anywhere in the world, scientists have found that the basic genetic differences between these two people would typically be around 0.2%, 0.2%, even if they came from the same people group. But these so-called, quote, racial characteristics that people think are major differences, skin color, eye shape, etc., account for only 0.012% of human biological variation. Dr. Harold Page Freeman, Chief Executive, President, and Director of Surgery at North General Hospital in Manhattan, says this: if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, the answer seems to be in the range of 0.01%. Ultimately, so minimal that there's no reason for it. These so-called racial differences are absolutely trivial. Absolutely trivial. The only reason many people think these differences are major is because they've been brought up in a culture that has taught them to see the differences that way. That's it. It's all about what you've been taught, what you've been educated, or, mistaught about things, and that's what we believe. And that's where we have to kind of relearn these things, okay? We know the Bible talks about the origin of people groups, right? It talks about, Adam and Eve, and Adam being the first man and Eve being the first woman. There's a kind of a long section on page 229 and 230 of your book. I'm going to skim through and point out a few things that it talks about. It says, we know that Adam and Eve were the first two people. Their descendants filled the earth. However, the world's population was reduced to 8 during the flood of Noah. From these 8 individuals have come all the tribes and nations. But because there was a common language and everybody lived in the same general vicinity, barriers that may have prevented their descendants from freely intermarrying weren't as great as they are today. In Genesis 11, we read of the rebellion of the Tower of Babel. That's where God judged this rebellion by giving each family group a different language. This made it impossible for the groups to understand each other, and so they split apart, each extended family going its own way and finding different places to live. The result was that the people were scattered all over the earth. Because of the new language and geographic barriers, the groups no longer freely mixed with other groups, and the result was a splitting of the gene pool. Different cultures formed, with certain features becoming predominant within each group. Okay, so it just continues and says, real science in the present fits with the biblical view that all people are rather closely related. There's only one race biologically. Therefore, to return to our original question, there is in essence no such thing as interracial marriage. So we are left with this. Is there anything in the Bible that speaks clearly against men and women from different people groups marrying? Okay, so basically what we've shown, both scientifically and biblically, is yes, there are some variations in skin color. There's variations in your book. Read this, please. It goes into more detail. Variations in different patterns, different eye shapes, different things. But ultimately, these variations are so small that there's no way we can say that they're a second race. And the Bible clearly says that we're all made from one person. We all have the same blood. Okay? So let's talk about marriage then. We'll go back to 2 Corinthians in just a second. But the Bible talks about the purpose of marriage, and a couple of them are in Malachi 2:15. It says to produce godly offspring. And in Matthew 19 and Ephesians 5, it says man and woman become one flesh. And so we're supposed to get together, become one, and produce godly offspring. Okay? And so the man and the woman must be one spiritually. Okay? 2 Corinthians 6:14, if we look at that again, it says, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion has light with darkness? This is not talking about race at all. It's talking about being a person who is saved and loves Jesus versus someone who is an unbeliever and doesn't. According to the Bible, the priority in marriage then is that a Christian should not marry an unbeliever, but should only marry another Christian. That's it. It says, your book says, if one wants to use the term interracial, then the real interracial marriage that God says we should not enter into is when a child of the last Adam, one who is a new creation in Christ, a Christian, marries one who is an unconverted child of the first Adam, one who is dead in his trespasses and sin, a non-Christian. That's it. That's the only thing the Bible says only marriage relationship that shouldn't be allowed. In conclusion, there's a couple things we want to say, okay? There's no biblical justification for claiming that people from different so-called races, best described as people groups, should not marry. The biblical basis for marriage makes it clear that a Christian should marry only a Christian. When Christians legalistically impose non-biblical ideas, such as no interracial marriage onto their culture, they are helping to perpetuate prejudices that have often arisen from evolutionary influences. If we are really honest, in countries like America, the main reason for Christians being against interracial marriage, in most instances, really is just because of color of skin. And that's not okay. Church and racism should do a few things, okay? The church can help relieve tensions by teaching biblical truths about our shared ancestry. We all come from Adam. There's only one race. The church and church can also talk about all people descended from Adam and Eve, and it can talk and emphasize and stress that all people are equal before God. And ultimately, what we need to remember is that we have to think like God, okay? And realize that God doesn't see respect in persons. God sees everybody the same. We read in 1 Samuel 16:7, it says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God doesn't look at our outward biological appearances. He looks on our inward spiritual state. Thank you.